Every empire begins as a whisper, a promise, a prayer in the wilderness, wrapped in fire and hope. The United States of America was never born in peace, but in defiance, in revolution and contradiction. From stolen lands and fractured dreams, it built itself into a beacon, a battlefield, and a paradox. For over 2 centuries, it has risen and stumbled, soared and shattered. This is not the story of a perfect nation. This is the story of a restless one. And if you listen closely, through every gunshot, every speech, every silent vote and shattered stone, you will hear it breathing still. This is the memoir of an empire, before it was a country, before the idea of liberty or the sound of gunfire at Lexington. The land that would one day be called the United States of America was a world of its own, ancient and deeply inhabited. For thousands of years, long before European sails appeared on the Atlantic horizon, this land was home to diverse civilizations, vibrant cultures, and deep-rooted spiritual traditions. The forests, rivers, and plains told the stories of the Iroquois, the Sioux, the Navajo, the Choctaw, and hundreds of other nations who lived not beside the land but within it, seeing no separation between nature and themselves. From the Great Lakes to the deserts of the Southwest, from the rocky coasts of Maine to the lush bayous of Louisiana, the continent pulsed with a rhythm all its own. Trade routes stretched from the Mississippi Valley to the Pacific Ocean. Complex political alliances governed regional affairs. Cities like Cahokia rose, with monumental earthworks and grand plazas, rivaling European capitals in scale and sophistication. The native peoples of the Americas were not static, they were evolving, but the winds of history were about to shift. In the late 10th century, Norse sailors, led by Leif Erikson, set foot on what we now believe to be Newfoundland. Their stay was brief. The cold, isolation, and clashes with indigenous peoples forced them to abandon their efforts. For nearly 500 years, the continent remained untouched by European ambitions. But the silence would not last forever. In 1492, seeking a faster route to Asia, Christopher Columbus, backed by the Spanish crown, set sail across the Atlantic. He did not find Asia. Instead, he landed on the islands of the Caribbean, opening the gates to what Europeans would call the New World. It was a beginning and an end. Beginning for colonial empires, and an end for millions of indigenous lives. Disease, war, and exploitation followed in his wake. The world was being redrawn, and the Americas were now its newest prize. By the early 1500s, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and England each laid claim to portions of the continent. Conquistadors like Francisco Pizarro subdued the great empires of Central and South America. But North America was different, larger, less centralized, and fiercely inhabited. Here, European colonization would take longer, cost more, and come with consequences that would echo for centuries. The Spanish made their mark early. In 1565, they founded St. Augustine in Florida, first permanent European settlement in what would become the United States. It was a bastion of empire and faith, complete with stone fortresses and Catholic missions. From there, they spread north and west, bringing with them the cross, the crown, and the sword. But their grip would wane as other powers rose. The English, having watched Spain grow rich from its colonies, turned their eyes westward. In 1607, they established Jamestown, Virginia, precarious colony beset by famine, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. Many died, others barely survived. But Jamestown endured, becoming the seed of what would grow into a sprawling English presence. In 1620, seeking religious freedom, another group, the Pilgrims, sailed aboard the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Colony. They, too, suffered, but with the aid of native allies like Squanto and Missouri, they survived a harsh first winter and held a harvest feast we now remember as Thanksgiving. By the mid-1600s, more colonies sprung up along the eastern seaboard: Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and others. Some were commercial ventures, others were havens for the persecuted. Quakers, Puritans, Catholics, and even debtors crossed the ocean in search of a new life. They built towns, planted crops, and imported enslaved Africans to work the land. As English settlers expanded, conflict with Native American tribes intensified. The most devastating early conflict was King Philip's War, led by Mithocommet, a Wampanoag leader, fueled by mistrust, broken treaties, and encroachment on native lands. The war claimed thousands of lives in shattered tribal alliances. it would not be the last time that blood soaked the soil over the question of who belonged to the land. Meanwhile, the Dutch were building their own empire. In 1624, they founded New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, purchased from the Lenape for goods, with about $24 a thriving port city. New Amsterdam was cosmopolitan, commercial, and multicultural, but its independence was short. In 1664, the English seized it without a shot fired, renaming it New York. The French, too, left their mark, settling in Canada along the St. Lawrence River. Cities like Quebec and Montreal became centers of the fur trade, diplomacy, and religious mission. Further south, the French ventured into the Mississippi River Valley, establishing New Orleans in 1780 and destined to become one of the most iconic cities in American history. French, African, Spanish, and Caribbean cultures mixed in the humid air, giving rise to a legacy still visible today. By the dawn of the 18th century, North America was a chessboard of colonial ambition. Spain controlled the Southwest and Florida. France held the heart of the continent. England dominated the Atlantic coast. But the future was uncertain. Each nation saw opportunity and each believed it had the divine right to rule. Native tribes still held much of the land, but their world was closing in. The thunder of war was on the horizon. The fight for America's soul had just begun. The early 1700s marked a volatile era of ambition and rivalry in North America. Though the continent was rich in forests, rivers, and mineral resources, its future was anything but stable. England, France, and Spain, three of the most powerful empires on earth, now occupied overlapping claims that would soon ignite one of the most brutal periods of colonial conflict the world had ever known. At the heart of this struggle was land vast, fertile, and largely undefined by formal treaties. The interior of North America, particularly the Ohio River Valley, became a powder keg. The English colonies were booming with trade and population growth, creeping westward. The French, with their interconnected web of fur trading posts and alliances with native tribes, dominated the St. Lawrence River and the Mississippi Basin, and the Spanish clung to the south and southwest with declining force but unwavering resolve. But beyond maps and muskets, another silent factor shaped a future: the Native American nations. Resilient and complex. Tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy, Shawnee, Creek, and Cherokee became critical players courted by empires, betrayed by them, and too often sacrificed for political convenience. For some, alliance with the French meant survival. For others, siding with the British brought weapons and security. But for all, colonial encroachment meant something was slipping away their ancestral lands, their autonomy, and eventually, their future. In Europe, these same empires clashed repeatedly over territory and power, and every time the drums of war echoed in London or Paris, they reverberated across the Atlantic. For wars, in quick succession, would shake the foundations of colonial life. The first was King William's War, the North American theater of the War of the Grand Alliance. It was chaotic, scattered, and deeply brutal, marked by raids on settlements in New England and Acadia. No clear victor emerged, but the seeds of animosity had been planted. Next came Queen Anne's War, a conflict born from the War of Spanish Succession in Europe. Once again, French and English colonists, along with their native allies, fought bitterly across the colonies. The war devastated native communities in the southeast, where English colonists in Carolina launched deadly raids into Spanish Florida. Meanwhile, French-backed Wabanaki forces attacked towns in New England. The war ended with the Treaty of Utah, which granted the British control of Acadia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay Islands, that were made without the consent of the native tribes who inhabited those regions. Then came King George's War, part of the War of Austrian Succession. The bloodiest conflict yet, it saw the British capture the French fortress of Louisbourg, a key stronghold, guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. But in a devastating move, the British government returned it to the French in the Treaty of Aix, infuriating New England colonists who had fought and died for it. The message was clear: colonial sacrifices could be discarded for European diplomacy. But none of these would compare to the eruption of war in 1754, a war that would fundamentally redraw the map of the world. Known in America as the French and Indian War, it was the North American front of the 7 Years' War, a global struggle that pitted the British Empire against France and its allies on 5 continents. It all began with a name now etched into American law: George Washington. In the spring of 17, a young 22-year-old Virginian major was dispatched to the Ohio Valley by the colonial governor to warn the French to vacate their forts. The French refused. A skirmish soon followed at a place called Jumonville Glen, where Washington's troops ambushed a French scouting party. Among the dead was a French officer, killed under unclear and controversial circumstances. The French retaliated swiftly, surrounding Washington at Fort Necessity. He surrendered, though minor in military terms. The incident became the match that lit the fuse of global war. Within months, troops from both nations were dispatched to North America. Battles erupted across the colonies. Native American tribes picked sides or tried to stay neutral, often unsuccessfully. The British suffered major early defeats. At Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry, entire settlements were massacred or abandoned. The frontier bled. Then came a turning point. In 1757, a new British Prime Minister, William Pitt, infused the war effort with renewed vigor and funding. British troops arrived en masse. Naval blockades were strengthened. Native alliances were carefully managed. And slowly, the tide turned. In 1758, British and colonial forces recaptured Fort Duquesne, renaming it Pittsburgh. Louisbourg fell again, this time permanently. The next year, British General James Wolfe launched a daring assault on the French city of Quebec, climbing the cliffs of the Plains of Abraham under cover of night. He faced the French General Montcalm, and both men died in the ensuing battle. But the British won, and Quebec fell. It was a death knell for New France. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris. The results were seismic. France ceded all of Canada and lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Spain, which had allied with France, lost Florida but gained control of Louisiana. Britain emerged as the undisputed master of North America, but victory carried its price. The war had nearly bankrupted the British treasury. The American colonies, though triumphant, had been reminded of their subordinate status, treated as pawns in imperial games. And the native tribes, having fought bravely and honorably on all sides, found themselves betrayed and squeezed from all directions. In the very year the war ended, the great native leader Pontiac would rise in rebellion, laying siege to British forts in a desperate act of resistance. The British, eager to avoid further native conflict, passed the Royal Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. But to the colonists, who had just bled for that very land, the order felt like betrayal. It was the first great spark in what would become a raging fire. The French were gone. The map was redrawn. The British Empire now stretched farther than the Roman Empire ever had. And in the American colonies, murmurs of unrest were rising. For while one war had ended, another far greater and more revolutionary was already being born. The year was 1763. The British Empire stood victorious. The French were expelled from North America, and King George III reigned over the largest empire in human history. But peace was an illusion, and the seeds of revolution had already taken root in the very soil drenched with British and colonial blood. The American colonists had fought alongside British soldiers. They had died in the same battles, defended the same flag, and believed they had earned their right to settle and expand westward into the fertile lands of the Ohio River Valley. But the Royal Proclamation of 1763 declared otherwise. To avoid further conflict with Native American tribes, the British Crown forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Too many colonists. This decree was more than a boundary, it was a betrayal. It was the first sign that perhaps London did not see them as equals, but as subjects. Then came the taxes. The British treasury was in crisis. The 7 Years' War had been catastrophically expensive. Parliament looked across the Atlantic to its 13 colonies and saw a solution. After all, weren't these colonies the primary beneficiaries of British military protection? Was it not reasonable, then, for them to help pay for that protection? The answer from the colonies was a resounding no. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a direct tax on printed materials. For the first time, the colonies were being taxed not by their own assemblies, but directly by a distant government in which they had no representation. The slogan spread like wildfire: no taxation without representation. The reaction was swift. Merchants boycotted British goods. Protesters took to the streets. Effigies of tax collectors were burned. A secret group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty emerged in Boston, led by firebrands like Samuel Adams. They organized resistance, coordinated boycotts, and stoked the flames of rebellion. Though the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, Parliament doubled down with the Declaratory Act, affirming its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That same year, the Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods like paper, glass, and tea. Tensions mounted. British troops were stationed in cities like Boston, not to protect from foreign invaders, but to keep colonists in line. Then came March 5, 1770, a snowy night. A tense crowd. British soldiers surrounded. Insults turned to snowballs. Snowballs gave way to rocks, and then a gunshot. Then another. 5 colonists lay dead. Among them, Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, became the first to fall. The incident would be immortalized as the Boston Massacre, a turning point in the colonial imagination. The British were no longer just bureaucrats or lawmakers, they were oppressors. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. It was a symbol of unchecked imperial power. That December, in an act of calculated defiance, American colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. It was not just a protest, it was a declaration. The Boston Tea Party electrified the colonies and enraged the British Crown. Retaliation was brutal. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts, by the colonists which closed Boston Harbor, dissolved the Massachusetts Assembly, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England. The colonies rallied in defense of Boston, sending supplies and forming a new alliance. The First Continental Congress, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia and issued a bold statement. The colonies had rights, and they would defend them. But the moment of no return came on April 19, 1775. British troops marching to seize colonial weapons in Concord. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. The British pressed on to Concord, but there, the tide turned. Hundreds of militiamen engaged the Redcoats and drove them back to Boston in a running battle known as the Shot Heard Round the World. The American Revolution had begun. That summer, the Second Continental Congress convened and appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Battles raged across New England. At Bunker Hill, American forces inflicted heavy casualties on the British, proving they could stand and fight. Still, many colonists hoped for reconciliation, but King George III rejected the Olive Branch Petition and declared the colonies in open rebellion. In January 1776, a radical pamphlet swept through the colonies. It was called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. In clear, fiery language, Paine made the case for independence. He argued that monarchy was tyranny, that America had outgrown Britain, and that the colonies must forge their own path. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth, he wrote. His words galvanized a nation. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. It declared that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It listed the king's abuses and announced that the colonies were free and independent states. The die was cast. The American experiment had begun, but independence had to be earned. The war was brutal. Washington's army was poorly trained, ill-equipped, and often outnumbered. The British captured New York and chased the Continental Army across New Jersey. But on Christmas night, 1776, Washington crossed the Delaware River and surprised Hessian forces at Trenton, a bold and morale-boosting victory. In 1777, American forces won a decisive battle at Saratoga, convincing France to enter the war as an ally. French troops, ships, and funds turned the tide. Meanwhile, Washington and his men endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge, where disease and hunger nearly broke the army. But they emerged stronger, trained by Prussian officer Baron von Steuben, and ready for renewed battle. The war dragged on, stretching into the southern colonies, where brutal fighting between patriots and loyalists tore communities apart. But in 1781, with French assistance, Washington trapped British General Cornwallis at York. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the conflict. Britain recognized American independence and ceded territory east of the Mississippi River. The United States of America was now a reality. But independence brought new challenges. The new nation was fragile, bound by the Articles of Confederation. It had no president, no national judiciary, and little power to tax or regulate commerce. States operated almost like separate countries. Economic chaos loomed. Foreign powers tested America's resolve. And in 1786, an armed uprising in Massachusetts. The solution came in 1787, when delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia to draft a new governing document. After months of debate and compromise, they produced the United States Constitution, a bold framework that balanced power between three branches of government and between the federal and state levels. It was revolutionary in design and enduring in impact. In 1789, the Constitution was ratified. George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. The revolution was complete, not just a war for independence, but a transformation in how a nation would govern itself. From scattered colonies to United States, from loyal subjects to revolutionary citizens, America had been born not in peace, but in defiance. The torch had been lit and the world would never be the same. The year 1789 marked the dawn of a new chapter in world history. From the smoldering ruins of revolution, a republic had emerged, fragile, untested, and ambitious. The United States of America, barely more than an idea a decade earlier, was now a sovereign nation with a constitution, a government, and a leader chosen not by divine right, but by the will of the people. That leader was George Washington, a general turned statesman, who reluctantly accepted the presidency and the weight of shaping an entire nation's future. Washington's presidency set the tone for everything to come. He defined the role of the presidency with restraint and dignity, refusing to rule like a monarch, even as many Americans still longed for strong, centralized leadership. His cabinet included towering figures: Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and aggressive Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, the philosophical Secretary of State. Their clashing visions would shape the ideological divide of American politics. Hamilton envisioned a strong federal government, a national bank, a manufacturing economy, and close ties with Britain. Jefferson, in contrast, championed limited government, agrarian values, and support for the French Revolution. Their disagreements laid the foundation for America's first political parties, the Federalists, aligned with Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. As the 1790s unfolded, Washington navigated treacherous waters. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was ratified in 1791, affirming civil liberties and calming fears that the federal government might become tyrannical. Yet domestic unrest soon tested the government's authority. In western Pennsylvania, farmers rebelled against a federal excise tax on whiskey, seeing it as unfair and oppressive. In 1794, Washington personally led a militia force to quell the Whiskey Rebellion, demonstrating the power and legitimacy of the new federal government. Unlike the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution had teeth, and Washington had no intention of letting the Union fall apart. Abroad, the winds of revolution blew hard. The French Revolution, once admired by American patriots, descended into bloodshed. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte alarmed European powers. Britain and France resumed war, and American trade ships were caught in the crossfire. Despite pressure from both sides, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, striving to keep the young republic out of foreign entanglements. His farewell address in 1796 warned against permanent alliances and political factions, warnings that would be ignored almost immediately. In 1796, Washington declined a third term, setting a precedent of peaceful transition of power. John Adams, a Federalist and revolutionary statesman, succeeded him as the second president, but Adams' tenure was turbulent. Relations with France deteriorated into the quasi-war. An undeclared naval conflict fought in the Caribbean. At home, the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by Congress gave the federal government power to deport immigrants and suppress dissent laws widely condemned as tyrannical and unconstitutional. The backlash was severe. Jefferson and Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. The nation stood at a crossroads, divided not by geography, but by ideology. In 1800, a political revolution took place not with muskets, but with ballots. Thomas Jefferson defeated Adams in a bitterly contested election. It marked the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties in modern history. Jefferson called it the Revolution of 18, and it cemented the resilience of the American democratic experiment. Jefferson's presidency was marked by contradiction. A champion of small government, he nevertheless doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase negotiated with Napoleon as France gave America over 800,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River. For $15 million, the nation acquired territory that would one day become 15 states. It was one of the greatest land deals in history. To explore this vast new frontier, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead an expedition. From 1804 to 1806, they journeyed across mountains, rivers, and plains, encountering dozens of native nations, enduring harsh winters, and reaching the Pacific Ocean. Their guide, Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, played a pivotal role. The journey sparked national imagination and confirmed that the West held unimaginable potential. But with expansion came conflict. As settlers pushed into native lands, resistance intensified. The dream of empire came at a cost, and Native Americans would pay the highest price. Meanwhile, Jefferson faced challenges abroad. British ships began seizing American sailors, a practice known as They claimed that the men were British deserters, but often they were simply Americans caught at sea. France, too, interfered with American trade. Jefferson responded with the Embargo Act of 1807, halting all American exports. It was a bold attempt at economic pressure, but it backfired spectacularly, crippling the American economy and hurting Jefferson's popularity. In 1808, Jefferson stepped aside. His friend and fellow Virginian James Madison assumed the presidency. By now, the war hawks in Congress, led by men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, demanded war with Britain. They saw British actions as intolerable violations of American sovereignty and believed conflict would restore national honor. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. Thus began the War of 1812, a conflict often called America's Second War of Independence. The goals were many: end British impressment, secure Western territories, and perhaps even annex Canada. But the war was a disaster at first. American invasions of Canada failed. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. Yet amid these dark moments, flashes of heroism and resilience emerged. At Fort McHenry, American troops withstood a massive British bombardment. As the smoke cleared, the American flag still flew, an image that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. In the South, a Tennessee general named Andrew Jackson crushed the Creek Nation at Horseshoe Bend, then decisively defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. The battle occurred 2 weeks after the war had officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in Europe. News simply hadn't reached America yet. The war resolved little on paper. There was no mention of impressment or maritime rights in the treaty. But psychologically, the impact was profound. The British threat had been repelled once more. A sense of national identity and unity began to form. Jackson emerged as a hero. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and held a controversial convention in Hartford, Connecticut, collapsed in disgrace. The era of good feelings followed a brief period of political harmony, economic expansion, and optimism. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed over slavery, over native lands, and over the balance of power between states and the federal government. The infant republic had survived war, rebellion, and global isolation. It had expanded westward, strengthened its institutions, and begun forging a national identity. But the questions of who was truly free, who belonged, and who would lead this growing empire had only begun. The United States had taken its first breath. Now, it would have to learn how to walk. By the end of the War of 1812, the United States no longer looked like an uncertain experiment. Instead, it had proven its survival, not once, but twice, against the greatest empire of its time. The British had been repelled, and the fires of Washington had been extinguished, not only in literal ashes, but in the rebirth of national purpose. What followed was not merely peace, but a confident surge of movement westward, outwards, ever deeper into the untamed landscapes of a continent that now beckoned with divine inevitability. It was the age of what Americans would call manifest destiny, a phrase that would come later, but whose spirit had already begun to animate. Every farm plow turned toward the frontier, and every new road carved beyond the horizon. America was growing not only in territory, but in belief, in ambition, and in contradiction. President James Monroe presided over what newspapers called the era of good feelings, a moment in which party divisions seemed to fade, and national unity appeared almost tangible. The War of 1812 had left Americans feeling self-sufficient, proud, and protected. The nation was still young, but no longer fragile. The economy began to shift from a purely agrarian engine to one fueled by industrial promise. Canals like the Erie began to thread rivers and cities together. Railroads emerged like veins of iron across the East. New England textile mills spun labor and cotton into empire. Yet for all its progress, the country was also beginning to unravel beneath its polished surface. The contradictions that had been embedded since the Constitution between free and slave. Federal and state, civilized and indigenous were no longer philosophical. They were physical, and they were spreading. In 1819, the Missouri Territory requested admission to the Union as a slave state. What followed was a political firestorm. Northern states, many of which had abolished slavery, saw the expansion of slave states as a threat to the balance of power in Congress. Southerners, who had built their wealth on the backs of enslaved black labor, viewed any restriction as an existential attack. The compromise that followed in 1820 was a line quite literal, boundary drawn along latitude 3, above which slavery would be prohibited in new territories, and below which it could expand. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free state. It was a bandage, not a cure, and everyone knew it. The issue had not been resolved. It had merely been postponed, buried beneath legislation, and handed over to time. While politicians tried to delay reckoning, the American people kept moving. The frontier rolled westward like a wave. Native nations were pushed back with treaties signed under pressure or in bad faith, and when treaties failed, they were pushed back by force. President Andrew Jackson, elected in 1828, rose as a champion of the common man, but his version of democracy was narrow and violent. He expanded suffrage for white men, abolished the national bank, and built his popularity on an image of rugged defiance. But he also signed the Indian Removal Act, one of the most devastating decisions in American history. Under Jackson's orders, tens of thousands of Native Americans, Creek, Seminole, were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the South and marched westward along what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died of starvation, cold, disease, and despair. Their lands were given to white settlers, their history erased from the maps being redrawn every year. Even as native nations were displaced, another contradiction grew in the soil. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had transformed Southern agriculture into a machine of expansion and cruelty. Cotton fields stretched like endless white oceans across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed, and the internal slave trade, buying and selling people within America's own borders, became one of the South's most lucrative industries. In cities like New Orleans and Charleston, slave markets bustled with life. While human dignity was reduced to auction prices, families were torn apart, children were sold, men and women were shackled, whipped, and worked to death. And all the while, Southern politicians began to abandon the idea that slavery was merely a regrettable necessity. Increasingly, they declared it a positive, good, biblical, economic, and social. In the North, where slavery had been mostly abolished, a different movement was rising. Abolitionists began to organize, publish, and preach. Black voices like Frederick Douglass, a former slave who taught himself to read, rose with thunderous eloquence. White allies like William Lloyd Garrison, fiery and uncompromising, demanded not gradual change, but immediate emancipation. The country was not one nation. It was two, trapped in one body. As this divide widened, the map of America changed again. In the Southwest, a new drama unfolded. In 1836, settlers in the Mexican region of Texas, many of them slaveholding Americans, declared independence from Mexico. After a brutal war, including the legendary Siege of the Alamo and a final victory at San Jacinto, the Republic of Texas was born. For nearly a decade it stood alone, a sovereign slaveholding nation. But many Texans wanted annexation by the United States, and the United States, driven by manifest destiny, wanted Texas to. But Texas brought danger, conflict with Mexico, and worse, a disruption of the fragile balance between slave and free states. In 1845, Texas was annexed. Mexico, furious at what it saw as theft, severed diplomatic ties. The United States, under President James K. Polk, sent troops into disputed borders. Shots were fired. War was declared. The Mexican-American War was short but consequential. American troops pushed deep into Mexican territory. Cities fell. Generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott became national heroes. When the dust settled, Mexico had lost nearly half its territory. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States acquired what would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other future states. It was a triumph for expansionists. It was a disaster for Mexico, and it was a reckoning for America. The new lands revived the old question: would slavery expand into the West? In the Senate, in the newspapers, and on the streets, the country fractured along the same lines that had once been bridged by compromise. The Wilmot Proviso, a proposal to ban slavery in any territory gained from Mexico, was introduced in 1846. It passed in the House but failed in the Senate. Yet its very existence sent shockwaves. The North was beginning to organize politically around opposition to slavery's expansion. The South began to prepare for its defense not just ideologically. As the gold rush drew thousands to California, and settlers flooded into Oregon and the Southwest, the dream of a coast-to-coast nation had finally been realized. The flag now flew from Atlantic to Pacific, but beneath that flag, the Union was not united. It was stretched to its breaking point. Every new state, every new law, every election became a proxy battle in a deeper war, already brewing beneath the surface, and everyone knew it. The peace that followed America's greatest land acquisition was uneasy, fragile, and temporary. For though the Republic now spanned a continent, its soul was divided, and the blood had not yet begun to flow. The ink on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had barely dried when the map of the United States swelled beyond recognition. California, vast and golden, now belonged to the Union. So did deserts, canyons, mountain ranges, and the endless silence of the high plains. The stars on the flag multiplied, but with every inch of land gained, the wound beneath the Republic deepened. Expansion did not bring peace, it brought confrontation. It brought the slavery question to the front step of every courthouse, every newspaper, every soul that dared to call itself American. The line between North and South was no longer just geographic. It was moral, political, existential, and it was burning. California rushed toward statehood after the gold rush of 1849. Its hills swarmed with prospectors and dreamers. But would it be a free state or a slave state? That single question threatened to crack the Union in half. The answer came in the form of the Compromise of 1850. But the Fugitive Slave Act would be strengthened, requiring citizens everywhere to return escaped slaves to their owners. It was a devil's bargain. It appeased no one. In the North, abolitionists saw it as an act of submission. In the South, it was barely enough to quiet the rising chorus of blood was not yet spilled, but the ground trembled beneath the feet of those who could feel what was coming. Slavery was no longer an institution confined to the plantation. It had become a national crisis. It was printed in headlines, screamed in Congress, whispered in churches, debated in schoolrooms. It was embedded in the story of every territory that sought entry into the Union. Kansas and Nebraska were next. And the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854, crafted under the guise of letting local settlers vote on whether to allow slavery, ignited the fuse. The result was chaos. As pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, ballots gave way to bullets. Towns were burned. Families were murdered. And for the first time, the newspapers printed a new name for the heartland. In this chaos emerged a figure who would terrify the South and electrify the North. His name was John Brown. He did not speak of compromise. He believed slavery was sin, and sin must be purged with blood. At Pottawatomie Creek, he and his followers dragged pro-slavery settlers from their homes and executed them in the dark. Years later, in 1859, he would strike again, this time at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was Madison, seize the federal armory, arm the slaves, begin a revolution. But the slaves did not rise. The townspeople did. The Marines came. John Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But his death was not the end. It was the beginning. Church bells rang in the North to honor him. In the South, militias drilled beneath Confederate flags, not yet official but already real. The country was no longer arguing. Then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois with a voice calm as iron, and a mind forged by hardship, was elected president without winning a single Southern state. To the North, he was a beacon of moderation and principle. To the South, he was the final nail in the coffin. Even before he took office, Southern states began to secede. South Carolina went first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February 1861, they gathered in Montgomery and declared themselves the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president and raising their own flag. It was no longer rebellion, it was divorce. Lincoln stood quietly on the steps of the Capitol, his inaugural address a plea for unity, not revenge. He had no intention, he said, of ending slavery where it already existed. But the Union, he declared, was perpetual. Secession was illegal. Rebellion would not be tolerated. And then came the first shot. April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor. Confederate cannons opened fire on the Union garrison. The war that would define America began not with an explosion but with a rupture. The stars and stripes were lowered in surrender. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, and the nation unraveled into blood. The Civil War was not a single battle. It was 1,000 battlefields, 1,000 funerals, 1,000 letters home written by candlelight and soaked with tears. It was the thunder of cannon at Antietam, where 23,000 men fell in a single day. It was the frozen march to Fredericksburg, the horror at Shiloh, the agony of It was brother against brother. It was blue and gray, tangled in fields of wheat and cotton and mud. It was not romantic. It was not glorious. It was war at its most intimate and merciless. In the East, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, a master of maneuver and honor, bested larger Union armies again and again. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant, relentless and grim, ground Confederate forces into dust at Vicksburg. Across the South, William Tecumseh Sherman carved a path of destruction, burning Atlanta and marching to the sea with fire in his footsteps. The Union had the factories, the railroads, the population. The Confederacy had resolved terrain and desperation. But in the end, the math was simple. The South could not replace its dead. The North could and did. Yet the war was not only about preservation. Over time, it became about transformation. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all the enslaved, but it redefined the war. No longer was the Union simply fighting for itself, it was fighting for the end of human bondage. Black men, once proprietor, now wore Union blue. They fought at Fort Wagner, at Nashville, at Petersburg. They fought for a country that had never fought for them. And in doing so, they began to reshape the very definition of citizenship. The turning point came at Gettysburg in July 1863. Lee marched north, hoping for a decisive blow. What he found was death. For 3 days, armies clashed under blistering summer sun. On the third day, during Pickett's charge, the Confederate Army threw its heart into the fire and never recovered. Lincoln visited the battlefield that November and spoke just 272 words. The world would forget what was said there that day. He predicted he was wrong. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That sentence became scripture. The war dragged on. The South starved. The North bled. Mothers wept in every state. By 1865, Richmond was burning. Lee's army was exhausted, surrounded, out of food and hope. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, he surrendered to Grant, who offered generous terms and silent respect. The guns fell silent. The Union had been preserved. The slaves had been declared free. The nation stood on the threshold of rebirth. And then, just 5 days later, in a crowded theater in Washington, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth, an actor, a Confederate sympathizer, and a man who believed he had killed a tyrant. But he had done more than that. He had martyred the man who held the fragile pieces of the country together. As Lincoln breathed his last, a cabinet member whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." And so the war ended, not with parades, but with questions. What kind of nation would rise from the ashes? Would freedom mean equality? Would the South reconcile or resist? Would the promises of the Declaration finally be honored or merely postponed again? The blood had been spilled. The chains had been broken, but the battle for America's soul was not over. It had only just begun. The war was over, but peace did not come easily. The cannons had fallen silent, but the air was still thick with grief, anger, and questions that no battlefield had resolved. Cities in ruins, fields turned to cemeteries, a generation of men buried beneath scorched earth, and marble slabs. America emerged from its own civil war, not as a healed nation, but as a wounded one staggering toward an uncertain tomorrow. The Union had been preserved, yes, but what of the South that had broken away? What of the 4 million enslaved people, who now stood free, but with no land, no shelter, no wealth, and no place in the Constitution that had ignored them for nearly a century? What of the former Confederates defeated, humiliated, but still armed with pride and bitterness? And what of the man who might have guided this fragile reunion? Abraham Lincoln, now lying cold beneath the flag he died for, leaving behind a vacuum no successor could fill. The task ahead was immense and unprecedented. To reconstruct the South, to restore the Union, to define the meaning of freedom not on parchment, but in law, in daily life, in the streets, in the hearts of citizens. Vice President Andrew Johnson ascended to the presidency with a mix of Southern loyalty, and Northern allegiance. A man from Tennessee who had stayed with the Union but despised the aristocracy of the planter class. Yet his vision of Reconstruction clashed almost instantly with the will of Congress. He offered rapid pardons to former Confederates, allowing them to regain property, power, and political control. He opposed giving rights to freedmen. He believed, like many of his time, that freedom did not mean equality. And so in state after southern state, as Union troops withdrew, the old guard returned not with whips and chains perhaps, but with laws and policy and violence dressed in legal robes. The former Confederacy began to pass the Black Code's restrictions designed to keep Black Americans in a condition not far from slavery. They could not vote, could not serve on juries, could not testify against whites, could not move freely. Labor contracts bound them to fields. They no longer served as slaves, but were now trapped in by poverty and legal fiction. The North watched in outrage, and a wave of radicalism swept through Congress. The radical Republicans, led by men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, had no intention of letting the South rise unchanged. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, enshrined the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all born on American soil, and eventually the 5th Amendment, which declared that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But laws alone could not change hearts, and as the ink dried on new constitutions and oaths of loyalty, a darker movement began to rise, one that did not seek compromise or progress, only revenge. In the dead of night, in white hoods and flowing robes, the Ku Klux Klan was born, not merely as a terrorist group, but as a movement of fear. They lynched, they burned, they threatened anyone black or white who dared to build a different South. Schools were torched, Freedmen's Bureau agents were murdered, black voters were dragged from ballot boxes and beaten in the name of preserving what the war had supposedly ended. The Reconstruction governments, many led by newly elected black officials and their Republican allies, struggled to maintain power under such relentless assault. They passed laws, opened schools, expanded voting rights, and for a brief moment, the South glimpsed a different future, one of integration, education, and shared power. But that glimpse faded quickly under the weight of organized resistance. President Johnson, impeached by the House for obstructing Reconstruction, survived removal by a single vote in the Senate. Meanwhile, the presidency passed in 1868 to Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero now tasked with a peacetime mission he could not win with armies. He sent federal troops to suppress the Klan, signed the Enforcement Acts, and watched as his own administration became mired in scandal. Corruption bloomed in Washington, and public support for Reconstruction waned as economic crises, racial fatigue, and Northern indifference converged. By the mid-1870s, the Southern Democrats, branding themselves as began to reclaim state governments one by one. They promised stability and tradition, but what they truly delivered was the resurrection of white supremacy, now hidden behind law books and ballots, rather than battle flags. The final blow came in 1877 with the compromise that ended the contested presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. To secure Hayes's victory, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. In return, the South promised peace, but it was peace on their terms. The last Republican governments collapsed. Black citizens, newly enfranchised and briefly empowered, found themselves abandoned. Their rights, won in war and defended in blood, were stripped away slowly, systematically, and often violently. And so Reconstruction ended not with triumph, but with betrayal. The promise of liberty had been written into law, but the nation lacked the will to enforce it. The Union had been saved, but the soul of that Union remained divided. The battlefield had given way to the courthouse, the musket to the poll tax, the whip to the noose. The dream of a multiracial democracy, born in the ashes of slavery, flickered briefly and then was buried beneath the weight of what the nation refused to confront. The South had lost the war, but won the peace, and for generations to come, the question of who truly counted as American would remain not just unresolved but violently contested. When the last Union troops left the South in 1877, the flags came down, the drums were silenced, and the unfinished business of freedom was folded into speeches and forgotten graves. Reconstruction was over not because it had succeeded, but because the nation had grown tired of trying. The North turned away, the South closed ranks, and America, still raw from war and betrayal, industry, progress. The country stood on the edge of something vast, not only in territory. It wanted to become a giant, and so it did, not with philosophy, not with poetry, but with steel, steam, and smoke. The Gilded Age had begun, not golden in truth, but gilded, brilliant on the surface and corroded underneath. The cities swelled first. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco rose like cathedrals of modernity, their skylines spiked with chimneys and cranes. Factories multiplied, powered by coal and labor, churning out rails, nails, and dreams. The railroad stitched the continent together, tying east to west, steel to frontier, profit to empire. The Transcontinental Railway was not just a triumph of engineering. It was the declaration that America would no longer be contained. Trains roared across plains that had once belonged to buffalo and nations now exiled. Freight cars carried goods, wealth, and people, millions of people. Immigrants poured into Ellis Island and Angel Island in waves that seemed endless. Italians, Poles, Irish, Jews, Chinese, and Slavs arrived with calloused hands and eyes full of uncertainty, fleeing poverty and persecution, hoping to find a piece of that American promise whispered across oceans. They found work but not safety. Tenement slums, 16-hour workdays, child labor, and brutal conditions awaited them. In steel mills and garment factories, in mines deep underground and canneries reeking of blood, they built the American machine with their bodies, and the machine ground many of them to dust. But still, they came, because even misery in America came with a faint perfume of possibility. A new class of men, emerged titans, monopolists, captains of industry, and robber barons, depending on who you asked. Andrew Carnegie controlled steel. John D. Rockefeller refined oil into power. J.P. Morgan turned money into empires. They built universities, libraries, concert halls, and charitable foundations, but they also crushed labor unions, exploited the poor, and rewrote the laws to serve themselves. Their wealth was unimaginable, their influence unchecked. The government, once born in revolution against kings, now bent at the knee to industrial royalty. Washington echoed not with Jeffersonian debate, but with a hush of backroom deals and gilded cigars. The Supreme Court, the presidency, and Congress stood watch but rarely interfered. Meanwhile, on the streets, a different war raged, one not fought with armies, but with strikes, picket lines, and locked factory gates. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 paralyzed the country, met with bayonets and bullets. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886 left blood on the pavement and deepened the divide between capital and labor. The Pullman Strike, the Homestead Strike, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, each another chapter in the long, unfinished struggle between those who made America and those who owned it. The workers demanded dignity, the owners demanded silence, and between them stood the state, almost always on the wrong side of justice. But while the cities burned with labor unrest, the West burned with something older and colder. The last of the Native American resistance was extinguished, not in one moment, but in many little bighorn. Wounded Knee, the trail of wounded nations. The buffalo were slaughtered, the treaties broken, the reservations carved and starved. The culture of an entire continent, reduced to museum exhibits in government schools where native children were stripped of language, dress, memory, and hope. The frontier had closed, and in its place stood fences, farms, and a silence that stretched from Dakota to Arizona. In the South, a different silence took hold. Black Americans, once citizens by constitutional amendment, were now citizens in name only. The withdrawal of federal protection had opened the gates to a new order. Jim Crow, through literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and raw terror, the right to vote was stolen. Segregation became law. Lynching became ritual. The promise of equality, carved into the 14th and 15th Amendments, was buried beneath mobs, court rulings, and the silence of those who knew better and said nothing. A generation born free now raised children under a system as cruel as the one their parents had escaped, less visible, but no less violent. And still, they resisted. In churches, in newspapers, in quiet dignity, and public protests, they endured. Out west, Chinese immigrants who had built the railroads now found themselves targets of exclusion. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 became the first federal law to bar immigration based on race. It would not be the last. America's gates opened wide to whiteness, and wealth bought closed hard against anyone who challenged its image of itself. And as America grew, it began to look outward. Hawaii was annexed. Alaska had already been purchased. The Navy modernized. The flags of ambition fluttered toward the Pacific. Then came 1898. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, mysterious and sudden, sparked the Spanish-American War. In a flash, the United States went to war with Spain, not just in Cuba, but in the Philippines. The war was brief. The result was empire. America seized Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and with them, a new identity. No longer just a republic, now an imperial power. The sun did not set on the American flag. The anti-imperialists protested, but their voices were drowned beneath patriotic parades and the thrill of victory. The republic that had once overthrown a king now ruled over others in his image. At home, the progressive era began to rise like a tide. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed the filth beneath the wolf-child labor, food contamination, tenement fires, political corruption. Figures like Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, and Jacob Riis pulled back the curtain. Reformers, both earnest and ambitious, pushed for antitrust laws, labor protections, women's suffrage, and government regulation. Presidents like Theodore Roosevelt stormed into office with promises to break monopolies and preserve the wilderness. The American character seemed to be splitting into half-engine, half-conscience, half-blind pursuit of profit, half-yearning for justice. A nation drunk on growth and haunted by its own reflection. As the new century dawned, the skyline rose higher. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds. Telegraph lines crossed oceans. Electric lights replaced candle flame. The automobile replaced the horse. The airplane challenged the heavens. And with every new invention, America told itself a new story that it was chosen, exceptional, destined. But destiny is not without consequence. And beneath the wonder of invention and industry, a storm gathered, not one made of inequality or corruption, but of fire, steel, and a world already dying to explode. By 1914, the world was on the brink of a war greater than any before it. Europe's old empires stood armed and suspicious. Assassination lit the match. Alliances drew the lines. Trench warfare swallowed the fields of France. The United States, for the moment, watched from across the Atlantic, proud of its neutrality, convinced in its exceptionalism. But the gears of war would turn westward soon enough, and America, for all its wealth and invention, could not stay distant forever. The Gilded Age was over, and the century of American power was about to begin. The war began across the ocean, born of empires, alliances, and a single bullet in Sarajevo. But its echoes soon reached American shores, not in gunfire, not yet, but in headlines, diplomacy, and the quiet shift of industry toward a rhythm of preparation. Europe burned while America debated. President Woodrow Wilson stood at the helm of neutrality, promising to keep the republic out of the bloodbath consuming kings and conscripts alike. But war, like gravity, pulls the unwilling. Submarines sank passenger ships, American trade suffered, diplomats whispered of betrayal and secret messages. When the Zimmerman telegram offered Mexico American land in exchange for an alliance with Germany, neutrality began to crack. And when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson called it what it was, a war against mankind. In April 1917, the United States entered the Great War, not as an empire avenging insult, but as a self-appointed guardian of democracy. The idealism was pure, the reality, less so. Millions of men were drafted, trained, and sent across the sea into trenches thick with mud, gas, and death. They marched under the banner of the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General Pershing, and bled in battles like Musargan and St. Mihiel, where machine guns sang louder than any anthem. At home, factories roared, women filled jobs once barred to them, Liberty bonds were sold, German names were changed, censorship tightened, and when the war ended in 1918, with more than 100,000 Americans dead, Wilson arrived in Europe not as a conqueror, but as a prophet. His 14 points promised a new world, self-determination, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to end all wars. But at home, the Senate refused. The League was born without its architect. Wilson returned a broken man. His vision, noble and naive, collapsed beneath the weight of American isolationism. The war had made the US a world power, but the world was not yet a place it wished to lead. What followed was not mourning, but euphoria. The Roaring Twenties arrived like a fever dream, fast, loud, and drunk on its own momentum. Jazz echoed in speakeasies behind hidden doors. Flappers danced with freedom in every hemline. Radios carried voices across miles. Movies became myth. Automobiles turned streets into veins of motion. Skyscrapers reached higher than prayer. The economy boomed, fed by speculation, consumer credit, and blind faith in an eternal upward climb. America had no time for grief, no patience for memory. The dead of France were buried, the trauma left unnamed. Prosperity had become religion, and Wall Street its cathedral. But gods built on illusion are easily shattered. On October 29, 1929, the stock market collapsed, and with it, the myth of invincibility. Black Tuesday turned into black years. Banks failed, savings vanished. Breadlines formed in cities that had once promised opportunity. Farmers lost their land. Families drifted west, toward California, toward hunger, toward dust. The Dust Bowl stripped the Midwest of its soil and soul. Storms of sand swallowed towns. Children coughed black into rags. And across the nation, the question echoed, had the dream died? Or had it only ever been a dream? Into this despair stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt.com, and resolute, his legs crippled by polio, but his voice filled with steel. His New Deal was not one policy but a tidal wave of action: public works, Social Security, banking reform, labor protections. The federal government, once small and distant, now became a daily presence in American life. Roads were built, dams were raised, art was funded, parks were preserved. Millions were employed not by capitalism, but by collective will. And still, it was not enough. The Depression lingered. Critics accused FDR of socialism, of overreach, of betraying the Constitution. But for many, he was the last thread holding the fabric together. Abroad, darker forces rose unchecked. In Germany, Adolf Hitler turned a shattered republic into a war machine. In Italy, Mussolini marched in the shadow of Rome. In Japan, militarists seized Manchuria and plotted expansion. Fascism spread like fire through a forest of despair. And though Roosevelt warned of gathering storms, America remained distant. Neutrality acts were passed. Isolation became doctrine. America first was more than a slogan, it was a vow. But evil does not wait for permission. On December 7, 1941, Japanese bombers fell upon Pearl Harbor, shattering battleships and illusions alike. In one morning, the United States became a nation at war. Roosevelt called it a date which would live in infamy. Congress declared war. Germany and Italy followed. The world was on fire again. And this time, America would not just fight, it would lead. The mobilization was total. Factories retooled overnight. Women welded ships. Black Americans migrated north in search of work and dignity. Japanese Americans were interned behind barbed wire, their loyalty doubted by a country they had called home. The war was not only against fascism abroad but hypocrisy at home. Yet the unity was undeniable. Ration books, victory gardens, war bonds. Every citizen, a soldier in some form. Across 2 oceans, American soldiers landed on beaches soaked in blood and history. In North Africa, in Italy, in France, and on islands with names like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. They fought, they fell, they rose again. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the greatest invasion in history, stormed the beaches of Normandy. On April 30, 1945, Hitler shot himself in a Berlin bunker. And on May 8, victory in Europe was declared, but the Pacific still burned. The Japanese would not surrender. Then, in a desert of New Mexico, scientists unlocked the atom. The Manhattan Project, cloaked in secrecy, delivered a power not of this world. On August 6 and 9, 1945, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated in an instant. Over 200,000 lives were incinerated in silence and fire. The emperor surrendered. The war was over, but something else had begun. The United States emerged from World War II not merely victorious but transformed. Its economy unbroken, its homeland untouched, its enemies defeated, and its arsenal now including the ability to destroy the world. Europe lay in ruin. The old empires were gasping, and America stood alone, wealthy, powerful, triumphant, and uncertain. For though it had helped save civilization, it now had to decide what kind of civilization it would lead. The bombs had stopped, but the world, once again, held its breath. The war had ended with a flash brighter than the sun, but in that light, the world saw its shadow. The United States emerged from the ashes of global conflict not just as a victor, but as a colossus. Its economy untouched, its military unmatched, its culture beginning to seep into every corner of the globe through jazz, blue jeans, and the quiet hum of radios carried by soldiers and missionaries. Yet even as it stood triumphant, it was not alone. To the east, across oceans and iron borders, rose another power, brutal, calculating, armed with its own ideology, and eventually, its own bombs. The Soviet Union had bled more than any in the war, and now it would not kneel. It too would build, would dominate, would spread. And so began a war without battles. A Cold War, a flame that burned not with fire, but with fear. It was a war of whispers, of spies in trench coats, of embassies and satellites, of chess games played in deserts, jungles, and boardrooms. It was fought in Berlin, where a wall rose like a scar across the heart of a divided city. It was fought in Korea, where lines moved and froze along the 38th parallel, while men died in mud 4 inches of ground. It was fought in Cuba, where missiles crept toward Florida, and the world held its breath for 13 days, staring into the abyss of nuclear annihilation. It was fought in Vietnam, where napalm lit forests and helicopters carved death into the canopy, where body bags returned by the thousands and belief in government began to rot from within. At home, the United States thrived and fractured. The 1950s brought suburban bliss, chrome cars, atomic families, and the glowing promise of a future painted in pastel. But beneath the manicured lawns and television smiles lay discontent. Black Americans, veterans, and citizens alike had waited long enough. They marched, sang, sat, stood, bled, and sometimes died for the simple truth that freedom delayed is freedom denied. The Civil Rights Movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and countless unnamed heroes, cracked the edifice of segregation. In courtrooms, buses, lunch counters, and bridges soaked in tear gas, America confronted its oldest sin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were victories carved in pain, but the struggle never ended. Meanwhile, a new generation refused silence. They challenged war, capitalism, conformity, and even the dream their parents had been sold. Music turned into rebellion. Universities became battle. Woodstock bloomed like a flower in the mud. The moon landing in 1969 showed what America could do when united reached beyond Earth itself. But on Earth, assassins took lives that had become symbols: JFK in Dallas, Malcolm X in Harlem, MLK in Memphis, Bobby Kennedy in California. Hope became memory. Memory became mourning. The 1970s brought disillusionment. Watergate revealed that even presidents could be liars and thieves. Nixon resigned, not with contrition, but calculation. The economy stalled. Oil crises darkened highways. Iran took hostages, and the nation watched helpless, humbled. But in the shadows, the Cold War endured. Arms races continued. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction held civilization hostage. The 1980s returned. Swagger Ronald Reagan declared mourning in America again. He cut taxes, crushed unions, poured billions into defense, called the Soviets the evil empire, and dared Gorbachev to tear down a wall. And in 1989, that wall fell, not 2 tanks, but 2 hammers held by ordinary bullets. The Cold War died, not with a bang, but a crumbling. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The United States stood alone, unchallenged. History itself seemed to pause. Scholars declared the end of ideological conflict. The 1990s became a decade of blinking light, cell phones, global trade, cable news, and digital illusions. Bill Clinton presided over peace and prosperity, even as scandals crept into the Oval Office. The culture exploded in 1,000 directions. Grunge, internet, reality television, moral panics, and promises of a connected world. America had no enemy, now except perhaps itself. But peace had always been a fragile illusion. In the corners of maps and margins of headlines, enemies were watching. Extremists born from war and radicalized by resentment whispered vows of vengeance. And in the dawn of a clear September day in 2001, 4 planes were hijacked to struck the World Trade Center, tearing steel, glass, and illusion apart. One slammed into the Pentagon. Another was brought down by passengers who chose defiance over despair. The towers fell. Smoke consumed the sky. Firefighters clawed through rubble. Mothers searched for sons. The world watched and wept. The 21st century had begun not with invention or celebration, but with dust, fear, and war. And yet, through it all, war and peace, lies and truth, horror and hope, the United States endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was restless. It tore itself apart again and again, only to build again, to redefine what it meant to be free. It failed often. It still does. But in its failures lie its power, the capacity to reflect, to rage, to protest, to rise. The republic that began as a fragile experiment now spans continents, commands satellites, writes myths in movies and music, and lives in contradiction. It is both beacon and bully. It is both dream and nightmare. And its story is not over. Because the story of America is not written in final chapters. It is carved in struggle, in reckoning, in rebirth, from revolution to civil war, from gilded illusions to atomic shadows, from protests to presidents. Born of those protests, this is not just a history, it is a confession, a prayer whispered, not by a perfect nation, but by one that refuses to stop becoming. The United States did not end. It evolved. It collided with itself again, and again, wanting, healing, remembering, forgetting. It built monuments with one hand and dropped bombs with the other. It enslaved, and then freed. It silenced, and then sang. Every page of its story is written not in ink but in fire, in blood, in ideas too bold to be erased. It is a nation still searching for itself, still arguing with its own reflection. And perhaps that is the greatest testament to its power, not that it conquered, but that it continued to question, to change, to become. History does not close like a book. It echoes, and long after the final chapter ends, the voice of a nation still speaks in every vocab, every protest raised, every child who dares to dream a better tomorrow. The empire lives on, not in marble, but in memory.